At a Japanese POW camp in 1942, an American officer had no weapons, no radio, and no authority, yet he stopped an Allied bombing and saved 2,700 lives, using nothing but dirt, discipline, and a message only bombers could see. April 1942, Makassar, Celebes Island. Under the tropical sun, 2,700 Allied prisoners were forced into a wide circle on the parade ground. In the center, a Japanese guard raised a thick, braided rope and brought it down again and again on an unconscious naval officer. 15 blows had already landed. 3 soldiers kicked the body methodically, as if finishing a task. No one spoke. No one moved. Every man in the circle understood the rule. Intervention meant immediate execution. Richard Antrim stood in the front rank, hands clenched, doing the same calculation as everyone else. He had no rank here, no command authority, no leverage. He was a prisoner, stripped of insignia, rights, and protection. The Japanese guards had rifles. The officer on the ground had seconds left to live. Antrim was not trained for this situation. There was no regulation for stopping an enemy execution, no doctrine for negotiating with a guard already in a frenzy. But Antrim had spent more than a decade at sea, commanding men in emergencies where panic killed faster than enemy fire. He had learned to read faces, voices, and moments when force would fail but composure might still work. The guard lifted the rope again. Antrim stepped out of formation. It was a single pace forward, but everyone saw it. Rifles came up. The circle tightened. In that instant, Antrim was no longer reacting to violence. He was betting his life on one idea, that even an enemy trained to obey orders could still recognize courage when it was shown without defiance. The guards froze, surprised less by the movement than by the calm behind it. Antrim did not shout. He did not plead. He walked forward with open hands, palms visible, his posture loose, his face controlled. It was the posture of an officer addressing a problem, not a prisoner challenging authority. His voice was steady, almost conversational, the same tone he had used on a lifeboat weeks earlier when men were drifting toward panic. Spoken English, slowly, carefully, choosing words the guards were likely to understand. He suggested there might have been a misunderstanding. He proposed that the charges could be explained. He framed the situation not as resistance, but as clarification. Around him, 2,700 men held their breath. Every sentence bought him another second of life or brought him closer to death. The Japanese commander stepped forward. He studied Antrim closely. Prisoners did not intervene. Prisoners did not negotiate. Yet this man showed neither fear nor defiance. When asked who he was, Antrim answered simply, "Executive Officer, USS Pope." The name meant something. The destroyer had fought before sinking. The commander's expression changed, just slightly. The meeting did not resume, but it did not end. The commander said the punishment would continue. The sentence had already been passed. Antrim accepted this without protest. Then he made his second move. "If the punishment must be completed," he said, "allow him to take the remaining blows himself." The condemned officer was already unconscious. Further strikes would kill him. Substitution would satisfy discipline without wasting a life already beaten beyond recovery. Logic was alien. In Japanese military culture, punishment followed guilt. You did not punish the innocent. But this offer was not defiance, it was sacrifice. The commander turned to his officers. They spoke quickly, sharply, weighing something no manual covered. In the silence, Antrim stood alone in front of the guard, fully exposed, waiting to learn whether courage would be read as insanity or as something worthy of respect. The commander raised his hand. The rope dropped to the ground. The kicks stopped. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the commander addressed Antrim in English. The offer had been seen. The willingness to suffer for another man was not ignored. The punishment, he declared, was complete. The unconscious officer would receive medical attention. Antrim would return to the ranks. Both would live. Decision rippled through the camp in silence. No cheers, no movement. The prisoners had learned that joy could be dangerous, but something had shifted. The guards carried the beaten officer away, instead of leaving him to die on the parade ground. Antrim stepped back into formation, his legs steady only because he forced them to be. A British officer beside him whispered that he should already be dead. Words spread without words. The Japanese had recognized something they respected, even in an enemy: the willingness to sacrifice oneself for others. From that day forward, the camp did not become humane, but it became predictable. Punishments followed rules. Beatings were no longer random. Food distribution stabilized. Medical supplies appeared for serious cases. Survival odds, measured in small margins, improved. Antrim also became marked. The guards watched him constantly. Any second challenge would not be forgiven. His courage had bought respect once, not immunity. He understood this immediately. From that moment on, survival depended on invisibility, patience, and waiting for the next opportunity. Opportunity came not through rebellion or violence, but through work. When American aircraft began appearing over Makassar months later, the Japanese ordered defensive preparations. Slit trenches would be dug to protect the camp from Allied bombing. Antrim was assigned to lead the labor detail. Guards, it was routine engineering. To Antrim, it was something else entirely. For the first time since capture, he saw a way to speak to the outside world without making a sound. The trenches were supposed to save the camp from bombs. 7 feet long, 3 feet wide, 4 feet deep, spaced evenly in straight lines across the open ground. A Japanese engineer lieutenant provided diagrams. Guards measured depth and distance with care. Any deviation would mean punishment, possibly execution. Antrim studied the plans and nodded. He understood them perfectly. 3 days, his men dug exactly as ordered. Clean lines, correct spacing, no mistakes. The guards relaxed, supervision loosened. That was when Antrim began to change things, quietly, gradually, invisibly. A trench placed 2 feet farther apart here, another angled slightly there. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be questioned from ground level. In the air, however, it would be different. Geography. He knew B-24 reconnaissance aircraft flew at thousands of feet. He knew analysts studied patterns, not details. The trenches didn't need to spell words at eye level. They needed contrast, shape, geometry. Over days of forced labor, he guided the placement until the pattern emerged only when the whole field was complete. Letters. Simple. Impossible to misread. U-E. Say. Curve was formed by spacing, each line by alignment. Where trenches were closer together, shadows darkened. Where they spread out, the ground lightened. The signal was large enough to be seen from altitude, but meaningless to anyone standing inside it. To the guards, it was still just a field of defensive trenches. Discovered, Antrim would be executed for espionage. No trial, no mercy. He knew the risk. He accepted it. This was not defiance. It was patience weaponized. The Japanese engineer returned for final inspection. He checked depth, spacing, and function. Everything met requirements. The trenches would protect against bomb fragments. He approved the work. The guards marched the prisoners back to camp. Antrim never looked back at the field. He had done all he could. Now he could only wait and hope that somewhere above Makassar, an Allied camera would see what the ground could not. October 1943. Allied B-24 seconds approached Makassar from Australian bases, their bomb bays loaded for the port and fuel facilities along the coast. Ahead of them, reconnaissance aircraft passed over the target area, cameras clicking methodically as they captured the ground below. When the film was developed and examined, intelligence officers noticed something that did not belong. In the port, outside the city, a prisoner camp appeared, and inside it, cut into the earth itself, were two large letters formed by slit trenches, U.S. There was no ambiguity. Someone inside that camp was signaling upward, deliberately, patiently, at enormous personal risk. The meaning was immediate. American prisoners were present. The camp was not to be bombed. Makassar was removed from the target list. Future raids avoided the area. Bombs fell on docks, storage tanks, and shipping lanes, but never on the camp holding 2,700 Allied men. Inside the wire, the prisoners heard explosions and saw smoke rising in the distance, never knowing how close death had come or why it never arrived. Antrim never received confirmation. He could not know whether the message had been seen or ignored. He simply endured the remaining years of captivity, malaria, starvation, executions, and disease, watching the camp population shrink while waiting for the war to end. Only after liberation did the truth surface. Intelligence files, reconnaissance photographs, the trenches, the signal. The Medal of Honor citation mentioned only the beating he had stopped in 1942. The trench message remained classified for decades, but its effect was undeniable. Without firing a shot, without speaking a word, Richard Antrim had turned forced labor into communication, dirt into language, and patience into a weapon. He saved 2,700 lives by understanding one simple truth. Even in captivity, war could still be fought if you knew how to be seen without being noticed. After the war, the photographs told the story. Antrim never could. Grainy black and white frames taken from thousands of feet above Makassar showed the camp exactly as the prisoners remembered it, and the trenches exactly as Antrim had designed them. Two letters, cut into the earth, visible only to those meant to see them. U.S. American intelligence officers confirmed what the prisoners had only hoped. The camp had been spared deliberately. Bombing runs were redirected. Target maps were marked. Antrim's message had worked. Estimates suggested that without the warning, repeated raids would have killed or wounded most of the 2,700 men inside the wire. Antrim never spoke publicly about the trenches. He never claimed credit. When he received the Medal of Honor, the citation mentioned only the moment he stepped forward to save another man from execution. The hidden message remained classified, buried in archives, unknown even to many who owed their lives to it. Lesson endured. Antrim proved that resistance did not always require weapons, and courage did not always look like violence. Sometimes it looked like patience, precision, the ability to think 3 steps ahead while appearing obedient. In a place designed to erase identity and silence men completely, he found a way to speak to the sky itself. Prisoner. He was unarmed. He was watched every day. And still, he fought the war his way. Not by killing the enemy, but by outthinking him. Not by escaping the camp, but by making the camp visible. That is how 2,700 men lived to see the end of the war, because one officer understood that even dirt, arranged carefully enough, could become a message powerful enough to stop bombs. Who survived Makassar carried the effects of Antrim's decisions long after liberation. Some left the camp weighing barely 100 pounds, bones visible beneath skin stretched thin by hunger and disease. Others carried tropical ulcers that never fully healed, lungs damaged by malaria, memories scarred by executions they were forced to witness. Yet when they spoke of how they survived, many returned to the same moment in 1942, the day an officer stepped out of formation when no one else dared. The moment mattered because it changed how the prisoners saw themselves. Japanese camp discipline was designed to erase identity. Prisoners were numbers, units were dissolved, rank was meaningless. The daily routine reinforced helplessness. Standing for hours at roll call, arbitrary punishment, labor without purpose. Survival depended on submission. Antrim's intervention broke that logic. It demonstrated that even inside the wire, choice still existed. Limited, dangerous, costly but real.
feared that I'd be further. It was resistance without spectacle. No shouting, no sabotage, no visible defiance. Just precision and patience applied over time. The brilliance of the act was not the letters themselves, but the restraint required to create them. Antrim did not rush. He did not draw attention. He waited until supervision loosened, until trust was established, until deviation could be hidden inside compliance. That discipline kept fully alive while they worked under constant observation. The prisoners noticed. They learned that survival was not only about enduring suffering, but about observing systems, routines, inspecting habits. What was enforced strictly and what was ignored. Antrim's approach spread quietly. Men became more careful, less impulsive. Not braver in the dramatic sense, but smarter. The camp did not become safe, but it became navigable. These guards never realized what had happened. They saw changes that met specifications. They saw prisoners working efficiently. They saw discipline. What they never saw was the completed pattern from above. This blind spot mattered. Japanese camp administration focused on ground-level control. Guards watched hands, tools, posture. They did not think in vertical terms. Antrim exploited that limitation. He understood that control is never total, only directional. Allied bombs began falling closer to Makassar in late 1943. Fear returned. Explosions rattled the camp. Smoke rose from the port. Prisoners braced for the last wave that never came. Days passed. Then weeks. The camp remained untouched. Men began to realize something was different, but they could not explain it. Survival sometimes announces itself only in absence. During liberation, intelligence officers debriefed survivors. Timelines were compared, reconnaissance photographs were reviewed. Slowly, the pieces aligned. The trench pattern predated the decision to remove the camp from targeting lists. The message had been seen, understood, and acted upon. Antrim's gamble had paid off. Water lesson unsettled planners. POWs had always been viewed as passive elements of war, liabilities to be rescued or statistics to be endured. Makassar challenged that assumption. Prisoners could influence operational decisions without escape, without radios, without violence. They could shape outcomes if they understood how the enemy saw the battlefield. Insight fed directly into post-war output. Survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training began to emphasize communication under constraint. Ground signals, pattern recognition, the idea that resistance could be quiet, prolonged, and invisible until the moment it mattered. Antrim's experience became a case study not because it was heroic in the traditional sense, but because it was replicable in principle. Made the story uncomfortable with its moral dimension. Antrim did not act out of anger or hatred. He did not seek revenge. He worked within the enemy system, obeyed orders, and used that obedience as camouflage. This blurred lines may prefer to keep clean. Resistance did not always mean opposition. Sometimes it meant understanding an adversary well enough to predict where they would not look. Antrim himself resisted the folly lesson. He declined interviews. He redirected praise. In his mind, the actions taken in Makassar were not extraordinary. They were necessary. That mindset was typical of his generation. War was not a stage for self-expression. It was a series of problems to be solved with the tools available. Tools, in his case, were not weapons. They were judgment, timing, and an understanding of human systems. He knew when to step forward and when to disappear, when to speak and when silence carried more weight, when courage required action and when it required restraint. He survived because of him, often struggled to articulate gratitude. How do you thank someone for something you never saw, a bomb that never fell, a blast wave that never arrived? Many only learned the truth decades later, reading declassified reports, or hearing historians connect fragments of memory into a coherent picture. For some, the realization was overwhelming. They had lived in not knowing how close death had come, or how deliberately it had been avoided. Hostile remains a reminder that war is not decided only by firepower. It is decided by perception. But what is seen and what is missed. By who understands the system well enough to bend it without breaking it. Antrim did not defeat the enemy in battle. He defeated the targeting process. He did not overpower those. He outfought them. Place designed to reduce mental labor and silence. He found a way to speak upward, beyond fences and rifles, to an audience that could act. Dirt became language. Spacing became meaning. And patience became the difference between life and death for thousands. It is why the story endures. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is precise. It shows what remains possible when nothing seems possible at all. The significance of Makassar becomes clearer when placed beside other POW camps in the Pacific. Many camps were bombed accidentally. Allied planners targeted ports, rail yards, field depots, and airfields, often unaware that prisoner compounds sat just a few hundred meters away. Survivors from camps in the Philippines, Formosa, and Burma later described bombs falling directly into barracks, killing men who had already survived ship sinkings, disease, and years of captivity. These deaths were not failures of compassion. They were failures of information. There was a gap Antrim exploited. He understood that Allied air power was overwhelming, but impersonal. Bombers did not seek people. They sought coordinates, photographs, patterns. If prisoners could change how a camp appeared from the air, they could influence decisions made thousands of miles away by officers who would never hear their voices. This was not hope. It was logic. What makes the trash signal remarkable is that it required collective discipline without collective knowledge. Most of the men digging did not know what they were building. They trusted Antrim's instructions because he never gave them a reason not to. In a camp where trust had been systematically destroyed, that mattered. The work succeeded because no one talked, no one speculated, and no one improvised. Every trench was dug exactly where Antrim indicated. Nothing more, nothing less. Discipline echoed the lifeboat weeks after the sinking of USS Poe. Antrim's leadership style never relied on speeches or inspiration. It relied on structure, tasks, calm repetition. Men focused on what they could control: spacing, depth, alignment. The larger purpose, invisible at ground level, only existed in Antrim's mind until the moment the photographs were taken. These guards, for their part, behaved rationally. They enforced what mattered to them: depth, spacing, protection from shrapnel. They did not care about aerial aesthetics. Their blind spot was not stupidity. It was institutional focus. Their system was designed to suppress resistance, not detect subtle communication embedded inside obedience. Antrim did not fight the system. He met it inside it. Deliberation. Allied intelligence quietly reviewed other camps for similar signals. In few cases, patterns were found. Unusual roof tile arrangements, cleared areas in vegetable gardens, laundry lines hung in deliberate shapes. Most were too small, too ambiguous, or too late. Makassar stood out because it worked. The letters were large enough, the timing was right, the signal was unambiguous. Even then, the story did not circulate widely. The war had ended. Attention shifted to rebuilding, demobilization, and the Cold War. POW experiences were often minimized, especially those that complicated clean narratives of resistance and activity. Antrim himself embodied that discomfort. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for a single, visible act of courage, not for a prolonged campaign of deception and communication that challenged assumptions about what prisoners could do. Selective memory shaped public understanding for decades. Courage was easier to recognize when it involved stepping forward under immediate threat. It was harder to celebrate patience exercised over months, especially when success was measured by absence rather than spectacle. No explosion marked the crash signal's success. No dramatic rescue followed. Men simply lived. historians, that makes the Makassar case invaluable. It forces a reevaluation of power in asymmetric situations. Control is rarely absolute. Surveillance is never complete. Systems are built to detect certain behaviors and ignore others. The space between those categories is where resistance can exist. Some actions also challenge the idea that leadership requires authority. He had none. No rank recognized by captors. No enforcement tools. Leadership, in his case, emerged from credibility built on stress and consistency over time. Men followed because his decisions kept them alive. Guards tolerated him because he appeared reliable. Both perceptions were carefully maintained. Modern military education, Makassar is often framed as a lesson in unconventional communication, but its deeper lesson is ethical. Antrim did not gamble recklessly with others' lives. He never ordered men to take risks they did not understand. He absorbed risk himself, first on the parade ground, later through solitary responsibility for the signal. If discovered, he would die alone. The others would survive by ignorance. Distinction matters. Many acts of resistance in POW camps failed because they spread danger indiscriminately. Radios, sabotage, escape attempts often triggered collective punishment. Antrim avoided that trap. His method isolated risk to himself while distributing benefit to everyone else. That is rare in wartime decision-making. Survivors were interviewed decades later. Some struggle with survivor skill, tied not to those who died, but to the narrow margin by which they lived. Knowing that slight error in trench spacing, a single insertion at the wrong moment, could have erased them all, created a different kind of burden. Survival felt fragile, contingent, almost accidental. Learning that it had been engineered deliberately by one man's patience gave that survival meaning, but also weight. Makassar endures because it reveals something uncomfortable and hopeful at the same time. Uncomfortable because it shows how easily mass death can occur through process and distance. Hopeful because it proves that even within those processes, human intelligence can intervene. He never described himself as heroic. That word implied exceptionalism. He believed his actions were simply extensions of duty under altered conditions. But history is less concerned with self-reception than with consequence. The consequence in Makassar was that 2,700 men went home. Because of firepower, not because of rescue, but because someone understood how to be seen by the right eyes at the right moment, without being noticed by the wrong ones. It's the quiet power of the story and why it still matters. In the years after Makassar was finally understood, military theorists struggled to categorize what Antrim had done. It was not escape. It was not sabotage in the conventional sense. It was not negotiation. It did not fit cleanly into resistance doctrine as it existed during the war, and that was precisely why it mattered. Peaceful resistance assumes opposition. It assumes friction, confrontation, and reaction. Antrim's method avoided all three. He did not oppose the Japanese system. He complied with it so completely that he was trusted. That trust created space. Inside that space, he acted. This inversion, using obedience as concealment, runs counter to most instinctive ideas about resistance, which is why it took decades to be properly recognized. Makassar also exposes a truth about modern warfare that remains relevant. Decisions that determine life and death are often made far from the people affected by them. Allied air crews never saw the prisoners. Intelligence officers never heard their voices. Heartbeat decisions were abstractions filtered through photographs, maps, and procedures. The system was rational, efficient, and deadly. It did not count for nuance unless nuance could be encoded into its language. Antrim learned that language. He understood that the war, at that level, was fought in symbols and shapes. He did not need to tell Allied forces who he was, or how many men were imprisoned, or how desperate their situation had become. He only target? Others in the group answered that question decisively. There is an important misconception that courage is always loud, that it announces itself, that it demands recognition. Makassar shows the opposite. The most effective act of courage in the camp was invisible by design. It required Antrim to suppress ego, urgency, and the natural desire to be seen. He already accepted invisibility once, during the beating. That act worked precisely because it was rare. To repeat, it would have been fatal. He adapted. Adaptability is the through line of his story. On the lifeboat, he adapted leadership to panic and dehydration. In the camp, he adapted courage to surveillance and constraint. Where survival meant silence instead of speech, he embraced silence fully. This ability to change forms of leadership depending on environment is what separates confidence from wisdom. Many POW camps had brave men. Many had acts of defiance. Few had acts of sustained, system-aware intelligence. That is why Makassar stands apart. It was not a product of desperation. It was a product of clarity. Deputy Commander who spared Antrim's life in 1942 unknowingly enabled everything that followed. That simple decision created the conditions under which trust, however limited, could form. It is tempting to view that moment purely as moral recognition, but it was also strategic. By acknowledging Antrim's sacrifice, the commander stabilized the camp. Predictability reduced unrest. From his perspective, it was rational. Rationality extended to the trench project. Academy's engineers wanted functional bomb shelters. Antrim delivered exactly that. The trenches would have protected prisoners if bombs had fallen. This dual-purpose design mattered. The signal did not compromise safety. It enhanced it. That alignment of enemy interest and prisoner survival is why the deception held. The trenches being purely symbolic, discovery would have been likely. Had they been structurally inferior, inspection would have failed. Antrim did not choose between resistance and compliance. He merged them. Modern readers, this is perhaps the most unsettling lesson. Effective resistance does not always look like resistance. It can look indistinguishable from obedience until the moment its effect becomes irreversible. Of Makassar went home to ordinary lives. They became teachers, mechanics, clerks, fathers, and grandfathers. Few spoke at length about captivity. Few still understood why they had survived when so many others did not. Time blurred details. Memory softened edges. Only fragments remained. The heat, the hunger, the fear of the buried ground, the sound of distant bombs that never came close. The trench photographs were finally resevered and published. Reactions were mixed. Gratitude, awe, and, for some, a quiet grief. Knowing how close death had come reframed everything. It added weight to survival that had once felt arbitrary. Tim did not live to see that reckoning. He died before the full story entered public consciousness. In a way, that was fitting. His actions were never meant to be witnessed by those he helped, only by those who needed to act on them. Makassar remains a case study, not because it was unique, but because it reveals a pattern that exists everywhere. Systems grow large. Control creates blind spots. Rules create predictability. Predictability creates exploitable gaps. Intelligence lives in those gaps. Trump did not defeat guards, guns, or ideology. He defeated assumption. The assumption that prisoners were passive. The assumption that obedience meant submission. The assumption that communication required speech. Assumptions still exist in different forms today. That is why the story endures beyond its historical moment. It is not just a World War II story. It is a story about how humans operate inside systems they cannot design and cannot overthrow. Force is unavailable. Intelligence becomes decisive. When speed is dangerous, pattern becomes language. When invisibility means death, not always about endurance alone. Sometimes it is about perception, knowing who is watching, who is not, and how to be seen only by the ones who matter. Knowledge saved 2,700 men, and it remains one of the quietest victories of the war. The quiet nature of that victory is why it still unsettles people who study it closely. There is no single dramatic moment after the trenches are approved. No confrontation, no signal flare, no confirmation. From the prisoner's perspective, nothing happens, and yet everything changes. The absence of feedback is crucial. Antrim never knew if the signal worked. He never received acknowledgement. He never saw Allied aircraft alter course. All he had was the late consequence, the continued survival of the camp, that required a different kind of faith than heroism usually demands. Not belief in victory, but belief in process. Belief that if information entered the system correctly, the system would respond. Once, when we lived inside that uncertainty, bombing raids intensified elsewhere on Sleepy's. Explosions echoed across the harbor. Smoke columns rose into the sky. Prisoners learned to read the sound of engines, the rhythm of detonations, the direction of wind. Each raid that ended without impact inside the wire reinforced the fragile hope, though few dared articulate it. Hope spoken aloud had a habit of being punished. He said nothing. He did not claim responsibility. He did not hint. He understood that even knowledge could be dangerous. If a guard overheard speculation about signaling, suspicion could retroactively turn lethal. Silence protected everyone. The signal had done its work. Now it had to disappear into normality. The discipline of silence extended to daily life. Prisoners still died. Executions still occurred. Disease continued to thin the camp. The Japanese command hardened again as the war turned against them. Rations shrank. Beatings increased. The environment deteriorated, but the camp itself remained physically untouched. Survival became a grim arithmetic. Men died slowly instead of all at once. Distinction matters more than it seems. Bombing would have killed indiscriminately. Disease and starvation, as horrific as they were, left space for endurance, for chance, for liberation. Antrim had shifted the mode of death. That was the difference between annihilation and survival. Distance, the Allied hardening process, appears cold, but that coldness is precisely what made the signal effective. Intelligence officers were trained to act on clear indicators. The letters U, S required no interpretation. They bypassed emotion, debate, and doubt. They converted human presence into a category the system could protect. This way, Antrim did not fight the war as a soldier. He fought it as an interface. He translated human vulnerability into operational data. That translation saved lives because it spoke the only language that mattered at that altitude. The war is inside quietly reshaped thinking in unexpected places. Intelligence analysts began re-examining assumptions about denied environments. What could be communicated without radios, without paper, without speech? The answer, increasingly, was pattern, shape, contrast, context. Manuals later described this in neutral terms, ground to air signaling under captivity conditions. But manuals could not capture the psychological weight of executing such ideas while under constant threat. They could not be so restraint required to wait, the humility required to accept anonymity, or the moral clarity required to absorb risk alone. Qualities cannot be standardized. They emerge only when someone understands both the system and the people trapped inside it. First generation rarely frames their death as philosophy. They called it judgment. Judgment developed not in classrooms, but in accumulated exposure to failure, panic, and consequence. He had watched ships sink. He had watched men freeze in indecision. He had learned that action, taken at the wrong moment, could be worse than inaction. Makassar was the ultimate test of that lesson. Irony is that the Japanese never needed to be fooled in a dramatic sense. They were not tricked into doing something irrational. They did exactly what their document prescribed. They inspected what they cared about. They ignored what they did not. The deception succeeded because it aligned with their priorities. Alignment is what makes the act ethically complex. Antrim did not sabotage the trenches. He did not compromise their protective function. Had bombs fallen nearby, the trenches would have saved lives. His signal did not trade safety for communication. It achieved both. Balance is rare in resistance history. Most acts of resistance impose costs on those involved. Antrim minimized costs by designing a solution that served everyone's interest, except for one interest that mattered most to the enemy: control of information. All of information is the quiet currency of war. Makassar camp was controlled physically, but not informationally. The Japanese command believed they knew ways to sit inside the wire. They were wrong, not because prisoners had weapons or plans, but because they hid meaning. Meaning existed only from above. You arrived without ceremony. Trucks, medical teams, paperwork. The camp dissolved into logistics. Men who had survived years of captivity struggled to reconcile survival with relief. Men were too weak to stand. Some died days after freedom, their bodies unable to recover. Joe survived. He returned to service. He taught leadership. He spoke about decision-making under pressure, not about punches or signals. He understood that stories like Makassar risked being misunderstood. People would look for tricks, formulas, shortcuts. What he wanted to teach was judgment. Judgment is slow. It is context-dependent. It cannot be rushed or replicated mechanically. The French signals not trick anyone to repeat blindly. It worked because of specific conditions. Aerial reconnaissance patterns, insurrection routines, French geometry, and a commander who tolerated Antrim's presence. Remove any one of those factors, and the outcome changes. Fragility is part of the lesson. Success was not inevitable. It was conditional. Antrim accepted that uncertainty and acted anyway. Makassar is often summarized in a sentence. A POW signaled Allied bombers and saved thousands. That summary misses the substance. What saved those men was not ingenuity alone, but restraint layered over time. The refusal to act prematurely. The refusal to seek recognition. The willingness to remain invisible. World that often equates courage with visibility. Makassar argues the opposite. Sometimes the most consequential actions are the ones no one notices until much later, when the absence of disaster demands explanation. Prisoners of Makassar did not survive because the war spared them. They survived because one man understood how the war actually worked, far above the ground, far from the wire, in places no prisoner could ever reach. He could not escape. He could not fight, so he communicated. And in doing so, he proved that even in captivity, agency remained possible not through force, but through understanding. The final, enduring weight to the story. Not that message was hidden in the dirt, but that someone saw the war clearly enough to know where to place it. With time, Makassar began to occupy a strange space in military history. It was neither a battlefield victory nor a rescue operation. There were no orders issued, no medals awarded for the act itself, no eyewitnesses who could describe the moment of success. The proof existed only in documents, maps updated quietly, target lists amended, bombs that were never loaded for that clear reference again. Yet, from an operational standpoint, it was decisive. Air campaigns depend on certainty. Pilots accept risk. But planners do not tolerate ambiguity when civilians or friendly forces may be present. Once the reconnaissance photographs showed the letters, uncertainty vanished. The camp became a known friendly presence embedded inside enemy infrastructure. That single clarification altered everything. future calculation. This is why Antrim's action mattered more than any single bombing raid. He did not stop the bomb attack. He removed the location from the war entirely. And inside the wire, the shade was invisible to Absolute. It continued to suffer. It continued to die. But they were no longer living under the shadow of sudden annihilation from the sky. The randomness of death. Now, survival shifted from catastrophic risk to incremental hardship. That defense gave men time, and time was the only resource that liberation required. Audience sometimes debate whether Makassar would have been bombed without a signal. On paper, the port was a legitimate target. Fuel storage, docks, warehouses.